Hello, Mom over here, and welcome to a discussion on biomolecules. This is the module 4 of the physical science subject. For our learning objective, we only have one, and that is to explain how the structures of biological macromolecules such as carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins determine their properties and functions. So when we talk about biomolecules, as the term suggests, these are molecules that are organic and come from living organisms. Now, there are common characteristics between the four biomolecules. Mainly, they are composed of specific elements such as carbon, hydrogen, and there are also nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and phosphorus depending on the type of biomolecule. But the most common is they are all made up of carbon and hydrogen. So hydrocarbons, organic carbons. Next, they are covalently bonded together. So that means we have polarities present within the molecules, and the structure of these molecules will dictate their particular function. So as we go through the different molecules today, you will be looking or you will be figuring out what type of bonds are present between each of the biomolecule, what type of elements, and how that helps in the overall function and structure of the living organism. Right, so before we dive into the four biomolecules, let's define certain terms that you will encounter multiple times in the discussion. When we talk about biomolecules, they are made up of monomers and polymers. So when we say a monomer, this is a single pattern repeated over and over. This is the building block of the biomolecule. This is the most basic unit of the biomolecule. So if you imagine, for example, a long chain, one part, the smallest part, is considered as the monomer, while the polymer is the long molecule consisting of many similar or identical building blocks linked by covalent bonds. So again, if we have another comparison, imagine like a structure made up of Legos. So the single block is the monomer, while the whole structure is made up of multiple Legos or the monomers, and that creates a polymer. So for a better visualization, here we have the three different monomers found in biomolecules. So for example, in deoxyribonucleic acid or DNA, each long chain of DNA or strands of DNA is made up of nucleic acid. So that one simple single unit is of nucleic acid is the monomer. Now, if you combine multiple nucleic acid together, creating a long chain of DNA that is now made up of polymers. Now, looking at the carbohydrate polymer, you can see here that it's made up of repeated structures that is now considered as a polymer, while the individual unit of the polymer is considered as a monomer. So mono means one, poly means multiple. Here we have a protein polymer. So each part or amino acid for proteins is considered as a monomer. So two terms that you will be encountering, monomers and polymers. Now, there are four types of biomolecules. So when we say four types of biomolecules, we mean that all living things on our planet is made up of only four types of biomolecules. There is no exception. All living things can be broken down into these four types of molecules, namely carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So carbohydrates is probably one of the most common or the most familiar for you since we encounter this every day. As Filipinos, we love carbohydrates. We love pancit, pasta, spaghetti, and also the beloved rice. We encounter or Filipinos have a very carbohydrate rich diet compared to other countries. But yeah, that is an example of a building block or of a biomolecule. Now, according to this, carbohydrates is the most abundant biomolecules found in living organisms. Now, it can be made up of different types of monomers and polymers. So, in carbohydrates, we have specific terms for the components of it. So, when we say monosaccharide, so saccharide meaning sugar, because basically that's it. When we talk about carbohydrates, these are sugars. And then we just link the sugars in order to make different versions of carbohydrates. For example, the most simplest sugars there are glucose, fructose, and galactose, since they are only made up of one single unit, correctly referred to as monosaccharide. Now, if you combine two monosaccharides together, that creates a disaccharide. For example, maltose, sucrose, and lactose. So, maltose and sucrose are often found in soft drinks. That's why they say when you drink soft drinks, it's higher in terms of sugar content. That's because they have disaccharides instead of monosaccharides. For example, fructose is present in fruits, hence the term fructose. So disaccharide are more 2 units, so they are if you can imagine longer to digest compared to the monosaccharides, which gives us a reason why fruits are always much healthier than your easily accessible soft drinks. Okay, so next we have the polysaccharides. So the polysaccharides are much more complex and have more sugar in them because they have longer units of sugar. For example, starch, which we find in root crops, glycogen, which is found in animals, and then cellulose, which is the basic structure of the cell wall, which provides plants with larger or with stronger structures. Next. Alright, so again, to highlight the difference of the three different types of carbohydrates, from simplest to the more complex, monosaccharides are simple sugars made up of only one sugar unit. Disaccharides are made up of 2 units of monosaccharide, and they are linked together by a glycosidic linkage. Next, polysaccharides are made up of multiple monosaccharides, creating polymers, and often they are made up of thousands of monosaccharides, all linked together by glycosidic linkages. Okay, so to share with you, like what would it look like in terms of its um, chemical structure. By the way, this is still a Lewis structure, and I know you have encountered this during your last module on Lewis structures and in bonds, in chemical bonds. So again, when we say monosaccharide, this is only one. This is, by the way, creates a ring-like structure. So sugars in nature creates a ring-like structure, and it depends on how many carbons there are, how many or how big the ring would be. So for example, here for glucose, it has 6 carbons. For fructose, it has 5 within its ring, and galactose also have 6. Then they would have different amounts of hydrogen and oxygen within them. Next, monosaccharide. Again, remember these are just two monosaccharides bonded together by a glycosidic bond. So here you would notice that sucrose is made up of two monosaccharides, namely glucose and fructose. And then finally, starch. So these are bigger polymers, or polymers, because they are a combination of multiple monosaccharides. So here you will see that starch is made up of multiple chains of glucose bonded by glycosidic bonds. So there, that's your carbohydrates. So in terms of their function of polysaccharides, starch is of course considered as the storage molecule of plants. That's why the root crops, where these type of plants save their excess energy or excess sugar in crops, in the root crops like potatoes and so on. These are rich in starch because they are sugar storage. Next, the the glycogen is stored in the muscle cells of animals. So it is also like starch, a form of storage, but specifically for animals only. So you can imagine that glycogen is present in muscle cells so that the human or the animal will have a ready access to energy, because that's what carbohydrates are, right? They are the ready source of energy for animals. Okay. Next. Okay, so again, for the function of carbohydrates, for animals, this is an energy source that we can gain through cellular respiration or the digestion of carbohydrates. Next, we have energy storage in the form of glycogen for animals and starch for plants. And it also serves as structural support in plants as a form of cell wall. So remember that plants has to create bark, they have to create wood, and actually these are just a special type of sugar, which is the cellulose. So the cellulose are made up of sugar, and they are the very material that make up paper, wood, tissue, and so on, which is also demonstrates how good they are as a structural support. Now, they are also the component of the exoskeleton or the covering within or out. Sorry, exoskeleton is outside. So they are the covering of insects and crustaceans like crabs. Okay, so exam tips. If you want to perform your best during the exams, it's better that you eat less carbs, because carbs take a while to digest and will divert some of your body processes to digestion instead of towards your brain, where a lot of cognitive processes is happening during the exam. So it is known that there, food which is rich in carbohydrates are considered as brain blocking food. So, rice, cookies, cakes, muffins, and chocolate, especially those with high polysaccharides, will block your brain or will hinder the activity of your brain, because a lot of your blood will be diverted towards your stomach, where many of the processes are happening just to break down the carbohydrates you consume before the exam. So it's better to avoid carbohydrates before the exam. So instead, what is better to eat? Right, so it's better to eat foods that are rich in proteins before the exam. Proteins are known to boost your brain activity and induces mental alertness, especially needed during the exam. So eating nuts, yogurt before the exam is recommended. Right. So the second biomolecule that we will be discussing are lipids. And lipids has an infamous or a bad reputation among everyone basically, but lipids are actually a necessary component. It's just that there are bad lipids that are found in some particular types of food like trans fats. However, lipids actually play a crucial role in our cells and within living organisms. So let's explore what are their functions and what type of elements make up these biomolecules. So lipids, like the other biomolecules, are biological in origin and has a particular type of solubility, because it cannot be dissolved in water like the other biomolecules because of its non-polar nature. So as stated here, lipids are non-polar and are made up of non-polar covalent bonds, which makes them repel water. Water, on the other hand, is polar in nature. So if you mix polar and non-polar together, it's not really going to work. That's why if ever that you need to dissolve lipids, you have to use other organic solvents that are non-polar, such as chloroform and methanol. So in short, lipids are considered as hydrophobic, so meaning water fearing. Lipids are made up of long chains of hydrocarbons, so hydrogen and carbons, and they are important in making up fats, phospholipids, and steroids. Lipids are made up of large molecules. Unlike sugars, which are made up of monomers, lipids are very long in nature, which makes it more difficult to digest. You know what they say when they say that fats are very difficult to burn, which is why it's difficult or challenging to actually lose weight. So if your weight is made up of mostly lipids or your extra weight is made up of fats, it's difficult to burn because of its long molecular nature. So when we talk about lipids, most of it is made up of smaller molecules called glycerol and fatty acids. So unlike carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids, lipids are not made up of monomers. They are made up of long chains, and both these or all of these chains are hydrophobic and energy rich in nature. If you have like a healthy amount of lipids in your body, it serves as a reservoir of energy. The lipids are actually a very efficient way to store energy more than carbohydrates. It's just that sometimes our body stores too much energy in the forms of lipids, which makes it rather unhealthy. Now, if you take a look at this is an example of a lipid in the form of triglyceride. So when we say tri, it means three. So in this case, the lipid is made up of three carbon chains. So one, two, three, and linked together by glycerol. So this part is glycerol, the one here on the side, and then you have a fatty acid chain. So if whenever we are trying to burn fat, your body will try to break each carbon link, and that takes a while. So it really takes a long effort to burn lipids because of its very elongated and complex nature. Like I said, lipids are not all bad though, because it has multiple functions in our cells and in our bodies. For example, lipids store and transport metabolic energy. For metabolism purposes, they also serve as the component of the cell membrane. So the cell membrane, as you know, is a very important component of our cells, and it creates the lipid bilayer, which maintains the balance within cells. Furthermore, they are also key players in cell-to-cell recognition and in the immune response. So, since they are also the component in the cell membrane, lipids attached to the cell membrane help our cells to recognize each other and also to transmit signals. In other animals, they also provide heat insulation. For example, in seals, they have that extra fat called blubber, which helps them survive in very cold regions. They also waterproof the body, and this is important for mammals that are aquatic in nature. They produce fats on their skin so that their bodies will not be too exposed to water. Next, they also serve as protection around our body organs. So our bodies actually have a healthy amount of lipids around our organs just so that it can protect the organs from possible damage. So example, if we fall, we don't automatically have internal hemorrhage because there is a cushion made up of lipids. It's just that if you have an unhealthy diet, that cushion will probably start blocking your body processes. So it's always a healthy balance whenever we are talking about lipids. So it's always maintaining a healthy diet and healthy balance within these biomolecules. To further emphasize the importance of lipids in our cells, let's take a look at phospholipids in cell membranes. So Cell membranes are the outer covering of the cell, and it's made up of a lipid bilayer. So bilayer means two layers. Now the phospholipids is a perfect molecule for this because it's made up of two components: the phosphate group, which is hydrophilic, and then the lipid group, which is hydrophobic. So whenever the components of phospholipids are added to water, they are amazingly self-assembled. So in the case of the cell membrane, the hydrophilic head, which is the phosphate group, always faces the water because it's hydrophilic. On the other hand, the hydrophobic tail always faces inward, or basically does not want to face water, so it stays inside the lipid bilayer. So because of the biomolecule nature, or the charges of these molecules, they create this consistent lipid bilayer within our cells, which is very useful in making sure that no excess water enters the cell and no excess water exits the cell, because there is um, a wall or a barrier made up of phospholipids. Extra trivia: did you know that eggs have the most concentrated amount of cholesterol? And it actually depends on the type of egg you eat. For example, quail eggs have more cholesterol than chicken eggs. So mind how much eggs you eat. But according to this, studies prove that eating 1 to 2 eggs a day will raise your cholesterol. So it does raise your cholesterol, but there are further studies that it doesn't really harm a person, except if they already have high cholesterol in their bodies. So if you are a healthy person and you like eating eggs every day, that's actually okay, as long as you are able to burn that cholesterol. But if you are already diagnosed with high blood and you have high cholesterol already, then probably avoiding eggs is a better idea. Alright, so far we have discussed two types of biomolecules, namely, we have discussed carbohydrates and lipids. Now we move to the third type of biomolecule, which is proteins. Proteins is another common type of biomolecule we encounter in our daily diet, especially if you like to gain more muscle mass by going to the gym. And as your instructor or gym instructor or online guru would recommend, eating more proteins will help you build that muscle mass. So let's take a look at the structure and chemical function of these proteins. Alright, so proteins in terms of their structure are actually more complex than what we have discussed so far. They have something called three-dimensional structure, which will dictate what type of protein it is and will greatly affect its function. So we'll pause on that, but let's focus on the overview of the protein. So when we talk about amino acids, this is the monomer of proteins. So take one amino acid, which is the monomer, and if you have multiple amino acids, so when we say multiple, like hundreds and thousands, that creates the protein. Protein are actually very important for our cells because it composes like more than 50% of the cell's mass, because it provides structural support and basically the main component of our cells, not only our bodies. Now, in terms of their structure, proteins are actually more complex than what we have discussed so far. Well, it is made up of monomers called amino acids, but these amino acids have different types. There are 20 different types of amino acids, that's the most common, 20, and each of them have their own properties and specific charges within them which interact. That results in a structural complexity which creates a twist and folding within the protein itself, which contributes to a unique 3D shape. So to further discuss, there are four levels of protein structure, namely the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Now, this is a visualization of the 3D structure of proteins. But let's take a look at it at the primary level over here in the first box. So in the primary level, it sort of just analyzes what are the types of amino acids present in that particular type of protein. Remember that there are different types of amino acids and they have different elements and charges within them. So the succession or the sequence of these amino acids are analyzed within the primary structure. But moving to the secondary structure will analyze on the interaction of these amino acids. So remember that they have different properties. Now, these properties may lead to the amino acid to twist into a helical structure like this one, or it may also create a plated sheet or a stack of amino acids because they are bonded together. Now, a single protein may not only be made or it can be added with other types of molecules as well. So, when we talk about proteins, this is not strictly amino acids only. They could also have fats and carbohydrates within them. So, that contributes to the tertiary structure. And remember, these other biomolecules also have charges. So overall, the charges of the amino acids and the charges of the additional biomolecules will lead to the quaternary structure. So when we talk about quaternary structure, this is how the whole length of the amino acid chain creates a 3D structure within the or that creates the whole protein. So for example, it may create like a circular structure with a hole in between, or there are foldings in the sides and there are specific shapes. Now, these shapes are very important. So, for example, hemoglobin, which is the type of protein found in our red blood cells, is important in terms of its shape because it allows the transport of oxygen. If the shape of that hemoglobin is incorrect, then it will no longer be able to carry oxygen efficiently in our blood. So that's how unique proteins are. Their components are very specific. The amino acid sequence is very specific. The additional molecules is very specific so that it will have the correct shape. In terms of overall function, proteins are the component of enzymes. And enzymes, as you know, are found in our saliva and our digestive system because it speeds up chemical reaction. So basically, it speeds up the breakage of food within our body, which makes sure that we have a continuous supply of nutrients from the food that we eat. If we don't have enzymes, digestion will be very, very slow. So it makes metabolism very efficient. Next, it also plays a role in defense, storage, transport, cellular communication, movement, or structural support. To further emphasize the function of proteins, proteins are present as spike proteins in the cell membranes or outer covering of cell membranes and if the covering of viruses. So, for example, the SARS-CoV-2 virus was a difficult type of virus to fight because of its spike proteins. The spike proteins are read mistakenly by our cells as safe. So basically, the spike protein is the latch and key. So the spike proteins attach themselves to the cell membrane, and the cell membrane reads that as harmless, which allows the virus to actually enter our cells without the cell figuring out that this is actually quite dangerous and will destroy the cell eventually. So the spike protein is very important because in other cases, the spike protein will signal that it is a healthy cell or this is a friendly cell or a friendly component that is important for the cell. And that's what the SARS-CoV-2 is actually taking advantage of, because the spike protein is recognizable by the cell. It allows the entry of this virus. In other functions, we also have the enzymatic proteins. So these proteins have a lock-in key mechanism. So the key being the enzyme. So sometimes it triggers specific reactions in our cells by attaching to the lock. So if this is the enzyme, the green part, it will attach to the receptor of our cell, and it will trigger a specific response. So that's how some of our enzymes and even some of our hormones work. Right, so further discussion on the function of protein, we have defensive protein in the form of antibodies. So antibodies attach themselves to viruses and bacteria in order to neutralize them and will no longer harm the living organism. Next, they can also store proteins or amino acids. So for example, milk is very nutritious because it is a reservoir or a source of important amino acids needed by our body. Another source of amino acids are eggs. So the ovalbumin is the protein of egg white and is the source of amino acid for the developing embryos, if the chicken egg or the egg will actually hatch. But for us, we just consume it and then we use the amino acids in the ovalbumin for our own bodies instead. Next, it is also found in the cell membranes, wherein it functions as transport channels, where it will transport important molecules inside the cell itself. So another, as I mentioned earlier, an example of this is hemoglobin, which is a type of protein that our bodies use to transport oxygen. Now on to the last biomolecule. We have discussed three so far, namely we discussed carbohydrates, lipids, and now proteins is done. We move to nucleic acids. And I think this is another familiar topic, not because it's an important component of our diet, but it is an important component of our genetic matrix or our DNA. Nucleic acids are described as the molecules of heredity because they contain the genetic information within our cells in our bodies in the form of either DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, or RNA, ribonucleic acid. Nucleic acids are polymers, and they are made up of simpler monomers called nucleotides. There are different types of nucleic acids, but nucleic acids would have basic three components. So if you take a look at this image, it breaks down what are the components of all nucleic acids. First, you need a 5-carbon sugar, which is pentose. So this is standard. All nucleic acids will have pentose. They also have a phosphate group. That is also a standard. But the difference would come in the form of the nitrogenous base. So the nitrogenous base is constant among all nucleic acid. It's just that which type of nitrogenous base would be present would dictate what type of nucleic acid it is. For example, in the picture or the chart shown here, cytosine, guanine, adenine, and uracil are different types of nitrogenous bases. So as you can see, they will differ in the number of elements present within them. Cytosine and uracil are only made up of one nitrogenous ring, while guanine and adenine will have two. On the other hand, there are also nucleic acids only present in specific molecules. For example, RNA only has uracil instead of having thymine, which is the trademark for DNA. But again, these nitrogenous bases are one of the three components of nucleic acids. And if you combine nucleic acids together, you have the RNA and DNA, which is the genetic information for all living organisms. As stated here, nucleic acid stores genetic information to be passed on to the next generation. So each cell will maintain its DNA or RNA within its nucleus to ensure that it stays correct and it stays safe. And whenever these cells reproduce or multiply, they will also make copies of this nucleic acid so that the next reproduced cell will continue its function. We won't delve too much into the processes of the genetic information, but just focusing on the function of nucleic acids. Alright, so far that was all for biomolecules. Again, let's go over them. We have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. All of them have very important function in our cells and have very unique chemical structures. Right, so we'll end the discussion here. If you have any more questions, I will be linking additional readings. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to message your instructions for questions or clarifications. Stay safe. Bye.